Thank you for having me here. I appreciate you're here in this wonderful sunny day instead of enjoying the sunshine, so thank you for coming. How many architects do we have in the room? And how many? All right, so 2 architects and 3, yeah. And how many social scientists with different backgrounds? Right. And the rest of you? What? Yeah.
He's an architectural historian.
Right.
I'm also an architectural historian. Plus SDS.
Yeah, all right. And you're also architecture historians?
No, we used to sociologists for the first year.
All right, yeah, excellent. So we have a good mixture. Yeah. All right. So today I'll talk about controversies and the networked nature of architecture. And I will start perhaps with an image that is slightly provocative of a building that we all know, but we are never used to see it in this particular shape. Can you recognize this building? No, that's very good then. So I have chosen deliberately to begin the talk with this very provocative image. So this is the Eiffel Tower. And this is a proposal for the extension of the viewing platform of the Eiffel Tower. And maybe some of you have heard, maybe the architects among you have heard about this proposal of Serrero Architects from 2008. Basically, Serrero, a young French architect who graduated from Princeton actually a couple of years before this big controversy and set up his own firm in Paris, announced this project. It was published on all the online blogs and provoked a lot of controversies in Paris. Why? This was a new proposal for the new design, I quote, for restructuring the public spaces of the Eiffel Tower. And Serrero suggested basically doubling the size of the tower, highest observational platform, and he claimed that his firm's proposal was accepted after an open call and that the structure is expected to be assembled for the 120th anniversary of the tower construction, which was in 2009. But shortly after that, the government contracted firm that manages the tower, La Société d'Exploitation de la Tour Eiffel, they stated that the claims of the architect are hoax, that there was never a call for proposals, there was never a competition announced, and that David Serrero was never selected as one of the architects for the proposed extension. Nevertheless, this was all over the media space. And the media outlets that ran with the story included The Guardian, New York Times, Architect, Bustler, Daily Telegraph, Belfast Telegraph, and I can continue the list. So it was all over the newspapers and the blogs. I was quite intrigued by this story, and I went down to Paris to interview the architect to see what has really happened and whether there was really a competition. And I was really interested in who is telling the truth. Is it the society for the maintenance of the Eiffel Tower, or is it the architect? So this is another image that became very iconic at the time in 2008. This is how the Eiffel Tower would look like if extended by David Serrero, and you have this iconic top of the viewing platform. So I went to see him and I interviewed him in May 2008. And Serrero said, I wanted to do with the Eiffel Tower what Christo, this famous artist, who did the wrapping of the Pont Neuf, for instance, and the Reichstag wrapping, maybe you know his work. I just wanted to do what Christo did with Pont Neuf and other monuments. I just wanted to draw the attention to the Eiffel Tower. Because nobody notices this building in Paris. The structure is so dense, I'm quoting here, the city fabric is very dense, and it was just a strategy to give attention to this monument, stated Serrero. So the suggested alternation of a building of such an importance for Parisians and for visitors of Paris provoked a lot of reactions indeed, and has driven a big amount of criticism within the architectural community and the journalist community at the time, among Parisians and visitors of Paris. So many architectural blogs discussed the suggested extension. Journalists wrote a number of stories. They were all impatient to break the story and to tell the news, and later on were accused for failing to verify the facts. So no one was interested really in verifying the facts, in understanding who was telling the truth. Was there really a competition? Why is that the Eiffel Tower should take this particular, should have this particular extension of the viewing platform? So we cannot say if there was a competition or not. Or Serrero is simply a PR genius because he became very famous, obviously, after this controversy. We cannot say who is telling the truth, but the fact is that a lot of group felt concerned by the tower alternation and expressed reactions of affectedness, expressed concerns, expressed their opinions, whether they liked or disliked the proposed alternation of the viewing platform. And this all happened in blogs and on the pages of newspapers and different other media. So whatever the accuracy of the story, it had a positive impact because it made us rethink the importance of the Eiffel Tower for Parisians. It made us go back to Gustave Eiffel, the engineer who constructed it, and it made us also revisit the biography of Eiffel and also the previous controversies surrounding the design and the construction of the tower. We just discovered a series of previous controversies surrounding the tower design in 1889, and then proposals for demolishing the tower in 1913 because they decided it's too ugly, it was destroying the aesthetics of Champ de Mars and it had to be destroyed. So all this was in the newspapers, but it was triggered by Serrero's proposal, by the controversy that triggered the opening of these previous black boxes, of these previous controversies. So it made us realize that many other actors are involved in the maintenance of the tower today, and it tested also the attachments to this building. So as a result of this controversy, the building gained new friends and new critiques. This is a very interesting case, but my interest in architectural controversies began much earlier, and more precisely in 2001, when I entered the Office of Metropolitan Architecture of Rem Koolhaas as an anthropologist who was interested in understanding the process of architecture making. At the time, I introduced myself as an anthropologist, sociologist. I'm trained as a sociologist, and I introduced myself as such. As an anthropologist, sociologist coming from the school of Bruno Latour, and Rem guided me in the office. This is my very first day in the office, and this is the first thing I saw, this table of models. He said, this is the project for the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. This is the table of democracy. It took me some time to understand what was sitting on this table and how this was a table of democracy. This was, at the time, the most important project for him because he was just commissioned to design the extension of the Whitney in 2001. And obviously, this was a project that was politically important for him, and he was dreaming to design in a building, a huge building like this, a huge extension like this, in Delirious, New York. So I started following this project. And later on, I found out that the table of models contained not just scenarios for the future development of the building. So what you see here on this table are different types of models, program model, the site model, the circulation model, but it contains also different scenarios for developing this building. In addition, this table of model also contained bits of previous controversies surrounding the extension of the Whitney. So traces of history, traces of controversies surrounding the Whitney building. The very start of this study, and I would like to say a little bit more about the methodology of what it meant for me to follow designers in the process of designing the extension. It was quite an unusual approach because they were not used to have someone in the office who would sit and just watch them design, watch them work on the models, watch them take these very specific decisions that will be crucial for the final design of the Whitney edition. They were more used to a different type of presence. They were used to journalists coming to the office just for a day or just for a couple of hours. Taking an interview with the master architect only, with the star architect, with Rem, and then going back to their offices or their newspapers and writing an article about Koolhaas. No one questioned the design work of the young designers, those who were working around the table of models and working on a number of projects at the time. That was not just Whitney, but that was the Seattle Library, Cordoba, the Porto Music Hall, and other projects that were at the time in the office. The CCTV Tower also, at the very beginning of the CCTV Tower project in Beijing. At the beginning, even Rem was making jokes on the very specific status of the ethnographer anthropologist, spending more than a day in this practice. And he asked me, would you like to be like the invisible person in the office, or how would you like to observe us? Would you need a room full of cameras so that you can oversee the process? Obviously, I was quite embarrassed by this question because he tried to translate immediately my intention to do an observation, an ethnographic observation of design and everyday practices of design into architecture terms. He tried to immediately architecture my presence in the office, and it was obviously a joke, kind of Foucault type of joke, because I just imagined for a second the panopticon horror of sitting in a room full of monitors so you can oversee the process of design. This joke helped me, I'm using it now as a vignette, but it helped me understand and conceptualize further the position of the observer, the ethnographer, the anthropologist, watching practitioners at work, trying to study the practices of architects and designers at work, and how different is this approach from the one that the researcher that would decide to look at those practices from a distance and study them on the basis of a number of sources, archival sources if they are available, of course, because this is an ongoing project, or another type of sources that you explore from a distance. So I had obviously no intention to oversee the process so as to grasp the kind of general rules of design or grapple with the Genian OMA habits. I just wanted to be able to see the details of their day-to-day activities, to be able to look at the materials, especially the materiality of the model was quite important for me, because this was an important actor in the office and in the practice of Koolhaas. It's foam. The stereo foam, the blue foam, is predominantly used as a material, as a very flexible material of making models, physical models. Physical models are fabricated from the very start of the design process, from the very first experimentation, the very first thinking about the form happens not on a drawing, but happens with the model, with foam cutting. So obviously foam became equally important for me as the young architects designing around the table of models, and that's what I wanted to follow. I just wanted to be able to see the details of the day-to-day activities, to watch the architects draw and handle those models, to see them smoke on the terrace, to listen to their jokes in the kitchen, sorry, the presentation is a little bit pixelized, and to feel the pressure of the air when the tall silhouette of Rem appears in the office, and this changes immediately everything in the practice. To see these tiny fragments of, from the daily routine and to be able to witness the tiny decisions, the tiny operations of architecture making. This was the idea at the very start. And that is what I did for 2 years of my life, spent in ethnographic observation in the practice of Koolhaas. To capture the rhythm of design, I used various techniques of observations, which allowed me to stay also at different distances from the natives, which were the architects at that, in my case. So I was basically using a basic anthropological sort of basic anthropological technique. Malinowski, I was basically a Malinowskian type of anthropologist going in a tribe, which was a contemporary tribe of professionals, architects, trying to understand what is it that they do when they say they design, what are the rituals they share, what is their culture, and what is it that they believe in, how do they understand each other on a daily basis, and how do they happen to produce something that they call building. So I had these very basic anthropological questions in order to understand the design practice as a practice that is culturally established and shared within a tribe, which was the tribe of designers. I deliberately tried to remain at two different distances from my natives, from the practitioners I followed, at a closer distance to the actors so that I can follow the course of action but also take part in their activities, intervening and participating in little tasks like model making. I did some foam cutting and model making so I could participate and help the process, and also at a greater distance so as to be able to translate and inscribe the traces of observation and of actions and speech acts into anthropological narrative, into a kind of consistent ethnography-based narrative. For many historians of architecture and those who have read things about Koolhaas, about his practice, about the uniqueness of his approach, and I know there are historians in the room as well, so I apologize in advance for what I'm going to say. But for many historians and theorists of architecture who had the chance to interview Koolhaas and spend time in his office, lingering more than a day in the practice is a waste of time. They were telling me from the very start, so just don't waste your time spending more than, well, not a day, but a few days in the practice. So for them to explain Koolhaas's design and his approach, it's enough to refer to the larger theoretical frameworks upon his design. For instance, the impact of surrealism on his early work, or the influence of the modern movement, or his rapport with functionalism, or the theoretical influence of Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, even the Russian constructivism. So this was a consistent storyline. You have to look at the influences upon the creativity of Koolhaas. Another storyline would be to follow his background as a journalist for the Hagische Post, and screenwriter, his childhood in Indonesia, his background and childhood, his individual talent, of course, is very much brought into the story. And his fascination by Manhattan, for instance, and his theory of the skyscraper, of density and congestion will be explained by his Dutchness, and that the fact that the first settlers of Manhattan were Dutch, recreating their land with nostalgia. And the list of interpretations can be continued. They all revolved around those lines, and this is what I did in the first 6 months of my study at the OMA, because they provided me with access to all the archives, everything that was written. This was the AMO library at the time. In addition to this, of course, I had access to all the personal archives of Koolhaas, correspondence, and project files as well. So looking at this documentation, looking at everything that has been written on OMA and Koolhaas, I was thinking, I find it somehow surprising to see architecture theorists desperately trying to understand Koolhaas' style, idiosyncrasies, and strengths by simply referring to his singularity and his individuality as a creator, as if we were to judge him as a 16th or 17th century genius. So we either look at the figure of the creator and his talents and his genius, or alternatively, we look at realities outside architecture, society, culture, zeitgeist, social and political factors, contextual frameworks that could explain us why his buildings are so different or why his architecture is so specific and so different than others. So this was either the individual creator or the society, on the other hand. All the interpretations revolved around those lines. So my first questions were, why is it that theorists of architecture are more interested in the big ideas, in the powerful insights, leaving often design experience apart and even excluding his office practice as being significant for the understanding of his buildings? Why is that realistic accounts of the contemporary architectural practices of the design world are completely missing? And why is it that the prevailing analysis, buildings are interpreted as separated both from the conditions of their makers and the design experience of the makers? So we never connect the final product, the building, with the experience of the designers. We try to explain the outcome with the individual genius, background, some kind of influences upon the creativity, or with society, social, political factors outside this product, so which will explain why this building is made as such. But we never connect the final product of design, the building, with the process that makes it possible, the design process, the design experience of the creators, of the architecture makers, of the designers, that make it possible. And this was my intention with this ethnography of OMA. This was the idea behind starting an ethnography project. So a different way to look at Koolhaas, a pragmatist one, would aim at understanding the practices rather than the theorists and the ideologists, the actions rather than the discourses, architecture in the making rather than architecture made, the products, the final products. That is why I engaged in ethnography of design, and I followed designers at work, just like Bruno Latour did in the 70s, following scientists at work to understand the production of scientific facts. So to understand the meaning of OMA buildings and Koolhaas's architecture, I needed to forget, or just to put on hold, all the official interpretations and to look instead at the ordinary conditions of experience of the designers. To follow the way architects make sense of the world-building activities, to look at the routines, the mistakes, the workaday choices, the technical choices, and I also had to account for the cooperative, the collective activity of both architects and support personnel, human and models, paints and pixels, material samples and plans that all constitute the design world. I couldn't isolate the model, the models, the drawings, and the plans they were working with from the architects. The objects, so to say, of creativity from the subjects. I could not isolate them. I had to look at the design world of everything that happens, that humans and non-humans all together taken in a creative design process. So in a way, I was not that much interested in what's in Rem's head, but in what happens at the table of models. And the specific project I happened to follow was the Whitney Museum extension. A very quick summary of the history of the museum. The Whitney is a building from the 1960s. It was designed and built by the Bauhaus-trained architect Marcel Breuer together with Hamilton Smith and was completed in 1966. It's a very small museum compared to the scale of buildings you have on on Madison Avenue, because it's situated in Madison Avenue between the 75th and the 74th Street, downtown Manhattan. And as you see from the very start, this is a very unusual building. Is there anything that strikes you from the very start? What kind of building is this? It's in New York, given the fact it's in New York.
It's a non-high school.
Sorry, it's exactly. It's like a reverse. It's exactly the opposite of New York. It's a reverse New York. It's a non-skyscrapers, Olga says. So it's a very. That's the reason. One of the reasons, in fact, the building was very controversial from the very start, because it was very weird, because of the shape, because of the lack of windows. So there's just one window on the front and one on the side. There's a sculpture garden on the ground floor. The building was, and also it's separated with a wall from the adjacent brownstones, which are protected buildings from the beginning of the century. So this was a very unusual building for New York, and therefore it was very controversial, very much disliked by the neighbors, by New Yorkers, by the Upper East Side Historical District, the neighbors from the Upper East Side Historical District, and it was very controversial. It is also a museum for living American artists. So it's not a museum that is supposed to host paintings of Picasso, and we know in advance how many paintings are to be there in the collection, but it was supposed to host paintings of living American artists. So it was a small-scale building for such an ambitious program, because the more living American artists we have, the bigger collection is. So they did not anticipate the potential of this building to grow and the need for this building to grow and to have a bigger collection space. Therefore, 20 years later, the museum decided they needed a bigger space, and they commissioned another American architect, Michael Graves, to design an extension. I see some smiles on the architectural faces. Yes, this is the very the famous postmodernist style of Michael Graves. So he basically suggested, it's a very recognizable style in that sense. So he basically suggested to turn down the adjacent brownstones and to build a replica of the Breuer building, and a huge third part connecting the two buildings, the Breuer and the replica of the Breuer. This was an extremely controversial proposal. It started, the first project was from 82, then there was another project in 1986-7, and then the third one is in 1989, and again the projects were very controversial. They were very much discussed by the communities, disliked by the communities, by architecture journalists, architecture theorists, museum professionals, and the neighbors. They all disliked them for different reasons. The scale and the style, the postmodernist style, were the main arguments for the main reasons for this controversy, and the proposals were turned down. So a decade of controversies, basically, from the beginning of the 80s until the end of the 80s, a decade of controversies, and a decade that was even named the biggest aesthetic battle in the architectural galaxy by one journalist in New York Times, and the building was still not extended. Series of failing proposals for extending the building. 20 years later, the same proposal enters in the office of Koolhaas, and Koolhaas was commissioned to design the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and this is the proposal of Koolhaas. As you see, the suggestion is very different from the proposal of Graves. Koolhaas decided not to repeat the mistake of Graves, so not to tear down the brownstones, but to keep them and integrate them into a complex of 3 buildings. So we have the Breuer building, we have the brownstones integrated into the complex of 3 and also transformed so they could be used for museum space, and the third part that would connect the brownstones and the Breuer building. So it's a completely different concept of architecture of addition, and this was very much discussed in the office at the time when the proposal was prepared. So I followed all the discussions from 2001 until 2004. So these are basically the 4 years, the 2 years within this period, 2 years of ethnographic observation. And there was a lot going on in terms of what is architecture of addition. Is it just about joining a new part to an existing old building? Is it just about old and new, modern and traditional? Or is it about something more complex, which was indeed the argument of Koolhaas here, a complex of 3 buildings by skillfully redistributing the existing collection and reorganizing it and keeping the Breuer building, and especially the elevator of the Breuer building, pretty much influenced from Le Corbusier, the machine as a heart of the building. So the elevator from the Breuer building was supposed to be the connecting part in this ensemble of 3 buildings. If you look at this building from outside, and I don't tell you all about the prehistory, what would you think about this proposal? You can see it more clearly here on this picture. What would you think if someone tells you this is a proposal for the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art? Be very honest with me. It's a weird building, isn't it? Yeah? It's ugly, yeah? Definitely.
Yeah. New York City's been attacked by aliens.
Yeah, or dinosaurs. Yeah, they were even calling it the dinosaur building, but precisely because it was very unusual, ugly, weird. But if you don't understand how smartly it solves the constraints of the site, so it's a very narrow site, you have a number of listed protected buildings. The brownstones are protected buildings from the beginning of the century, built by developers at the beginning of the century and now protected, so they cannot be demolished. Only the little brownstone, which is in between the wall of the Breuer building and the brownstones that you see, could be demolished. So they, of course, suggested to tear it down so that the third part could be visible. There are other constraints like the zoning envelope, obviously. The Breuer building, which was highly controversial and very much disliked by the public in the 60s, 20 years later already was a modernist icon. And again, it was a protected building. And one of the constraints the architect from the Office of Metropolitan Architecture had was to also to show a respect to the modernist building of Breuer. So to build an extension which will be respectful to the existing modernist building of Breuer, which will not exceed the zoning envelope, will deal with the narrowness of the site, the eclectics of Madison Avenue, and will respect the brownstones because they are protected. These were some of the few constraints they had when they had to design the new Whitney. So in that sense, I also started to appreciate the smartness of the proposal, and I understood what they meant, that a building should be smart, by smartly solving a number of constraints and limitations. However, this smartness was not appreciated by the mayor of New York, the board of the trustees, the city planning commission, and the board of the estimate, which all rejected the proposal. Koolhaas had to go back to the drawing board, just like Graves did in the 80s when he had to redesign the building a number of times. He had to go back to the drawing board, and this is the second proposal. As you see here, this proposal is much more boring. You can hardly recognize the OMA style. You can hardly call it smart. You can't even call it ugly, no. It's a very weird kind of block structure. Again, this proposal was considered as not good enough for the by the Board of the Trustees, and it was declined in 2004. 2 years later, another architect was commissioned to design the Whitney extension, Renzo Piano. And this is the proposal of Renzo Piano, 2005-2006. So the project stayed in his office just for a year. At the time, I was very curious. My study was already over because I decided only to follow the process of design of the Whitney in the office of Koolhaas, and my first book was based on the Whitney story. So I just didn't want to continue, but I was curious to see what is going to happen. And I was almost thinking about going to Renzo Piano and telling him, look, this project is not going to happen anyway, because there was this history of extensions, history of failing projects from the 80s and Koolhaas' story. But a year later, his proposal was declined already, so it was not worth going and discussing this with him. A couple of years later, they decided to build a branch rather than an extension because it was too risky to build the extension on the site, on Madison Avenue. So they decided to go for a branch and then commissioned the branch to be designed. They commissioned Renzo Piano, not Koolhaas, to design the new Whitney. And the new Whitney the construction of the building is just completed. It's going to be inaugurated tomorrow. Yeah, it's everywhere in the architectural news. Maybe those who follow the news know. So the kind of official inauguration day is tomorrow, and it's Renzo Piano building in the Meatpacking District in New York. Obviously, the constraints of the site there are different, and we don't have the same number of limitations that Koolhaas and his predecessors, Breuer and Graves had at the time. So, why is this story interesting for me, and how did I make sense of it? Because it was extremely interesting and fascinating for me to discover this prehistory of the project, of the series of controversies. So, at the beginning, I was asking the question of what was wrong with the Whitney, what was about this building that it provoked so many reactions, good and bad, at the time of its construction in the 60s, but also at the time of the extension plans. What kind of actors responded to the museum actions and claimed to speak on behalf of the building? And of course, one way of answering this question was to look at the historical line, because you have the 60s, the 80s, 2000, 2001, 4, 6. So 3 moments in history. And of course, one way to answer this question is to deduce Whitney's meaning from the mythologies of the 60s, the 80s, and today, to look at the social context, and to try to compare the 3 buildings and why the proposed extensions were so different in 3 moments of time, in 3 historical moments. This was one possible scenario. Another possible scenario was to compare the style of the architects, 3 architects. In a way, it's an amazing object because we have modern architecture, postmodern architecture, and super hyper modern, whatever we call the style of Koolhaas, in one object. So it was an amazing, tiny object which could have enabled me to do this comparison of 3 different styles in one material object. To explain a building like the Whitney in the sense of mainstream social sciences, that means to produce a kind of social explanation of its architecture and the architectural projects. But it's not what I wanted to do, and it was not. This was not going to inform my analysis in this particular case. What I wanted to do is to follow all the design moves in the office of Koolhaas, and to see and witness the logic of the design process. Rather than comparing the 3 styles or comparing the 3 social contexts. So a comparative analysis of the figurative languages of the 3 architects would not explain the specific Whitney trajectory. But entering the office of Koolhaas to learn more about the ongoing process, I was gradually led by the architects, by the designing architects, to go back in time and revisit, for instance, the decisions of Michael Graves in the 80s, and try to see what is it that they take from the 80s and how they bring it back in the office of Koolhaas, and then go back to the 60s and the controversial projects with Breuer, and try to see what they learned from the 60s and from the specific design solutions of Breuer in the 60s, and how they go back to the Office of Metropolitan Architecture with a specific knowledge in hand. So this retrospective moment in history, of going back to history, to the historical kind of moments of decision-making on the design, and coming back to the office of Koolhaas was more important for me, rather than doing a proper chronological history of the Whitney and comparing the three buildings by situating them into three contextual moments, into three contexts, three types of contexts. By doing this, by following designers at work in the office of Koolhaas, and trying to understand how they make sense of this historical complexity of the previous design proposals, and what is it that they do to respond to the different constraints of the site, the zoning limitations and the other constraints, and how they solve these problems, and understanding the intrinsic logic of design in the office of Koolhaas was my approach. Of course, this led me also to go back to history and become do some kind of historical research, but not the traditional historiographical research or traditional history of this building, but only some kind of historical research that would help me understand how designing architects would mobilize the knowledge from the historical archives, and how this knowledge gained in the research process is then mobilized in design making in the present moment, in the moment of designing the Whitney and trying to solve the very complex problems of design. So the career of the Whitney, this very specific trajectory that I've illustrated here with this series of images, is the building career, and the trajectory was very important for me. In a sense, it was not possible for me just to talk about the Whitney by just showing one image, because the Whitney and the history of the Whitney was in the series of images. The Whitney was a trajectory on its own, and talking about the Whitney, I had to show all those images and all this series of transformations that the Whitney has undergone as an object, as a building. Going back to the 60s with the architects, but also with the help of some archival work in the Whitney Museum, because there was a whole archive that no historian had ever used at the time when I started working on this project. From the 60s, I was interested to understand what kind of actors gathered around those buildings, and you can see some of the actors which were discussing the Whitney at the time. The neighbors, the artists, the Whitney family, because it's a family museum. You have architectural critics, the board of the trustees, and of course American art, and New Yorkers are all gathering around the building site and discussing it. In the 80s, obviously, we have much more actors, because this is a more controversial moment, a decade of controversies, and we have, because the projects become public, and they had to get the approval of the Upper Side Community Board, the Landmaks Commission, and the City Planning Commission. All those institutional actors are there. The whole architectural community was divided into two parts: those who liked the proposed extension of Graves, and those who dislike it. The museum professionals signed a petition, those who were against and those who were for. the proposed extension. Modernists and preservationists were the two camps. So the journalist community and the museum professionals were all divided into these two camps. A big battle in the architectural galaxy, and more actors crowding around the building. And in 2001, 2004, we see a very similar crowd of actors if we look at the archives, the press clippings here. So in the 80s, I had a number of archives, for instance, the letters written to the museum director and the board of the trustees from different museum professionals across the country, but also from different architects. So that's called archive of correspondence, and also press clippings from the time, from the 80s. At the moment of Koolhaas's proposals, there was a lot of media coverage and also a number of archives I had access to when I worked in the office of OMA in Rotterdam, and we see a very similar crowd of actors. Some of them are the same actors which were around the building in the 60s, the 80s, and now at Koolhaas's time, some of them are different. For instance, the City Planning Commission, the Landmaks Commission, as institutional actors are around. Obviously, the artists, the journalists, the museum community, and the Whitney Board of the Trustees are there as well. So as we see here, there's a very similar process like the Eiffel Tower, like with the Eiffel Tower example, which I started this lecture with. We can witness a very similar process here. But as the controversy developed, we see a bigger number of actors and resources were mobilized. Even actors which were absolutely not interested in design, or not actors who did not have the competence to discuss design, were there because they were intrigued by the whole controversy. And also new connections were traced among those actors. So gaining more allies and critiques, letters of support and complaints, and agitating different city groups, the Whitney became a full-blown actor. So we followed this process of mobilizing and enrolling different communities, different groups, and different actors in the process of debating the extensions, whether they are good or not, for the Whitney. And as the Whitney mobilizes more actors, and whether negatively or positively mobilized, it becomes an actor on its own. So the more people spoke against and in support of this building, the bigger the crowds of visitors and passers-by got. The more the resources and allies locally available increased, the more social did design become. So we see an example here where if we follow the controversies, not just the building as a static object, but we follow the controversies as a process of contesting the building and the proposed extensions, in the many detours in the architecture's intentions to extend the building, we do not see any longer one static modernist object, a construction, but we see an object plus its anticipated extensions, the different plans and proposals, plus a variety of actors, all those actors that have drawn with bubbles in a very naive way. So as an attempt to understand what the building is not equal to the image, to the kind of geometric representation of symmetric and harmonically organized composition in space, in an Euclidean space. But the building is something much more complex. It's this object plus all the anticipated extensions, proposals, and plans, plus all those actors with their concerns and what they say about the proposed extension. So this is indeed something very complex, which we can describe as a multiple object, or we can draw in a very abstract way, as what you see on the picture. A kind of knots of tensions and kind of multiple object or a complex ecology. I don't know how to call this very weird object that appears in the controversies. And as the controversies unfold, the Whitney also that looked very simple and technical and aesthetic object at the start of this process, in the controversy became socio-technical, socio-aesthetic, socio-political object. From built once in the 60s and forgotten, it became potentially extendable. From taken from granted, it became contested. From immediate, mediated. From rapid, very slow. From a static object, it becomes a bird in a fly. So it's something that we can only grasp as we follow it moving, as we follow the different variations, the different transformations of the object. Not an autonomous, emancipated, coherent, modernist object standing out there on Madison Avenue, but a complex ecology indeed. So can we say then that there is a society outside this building or a social context outside this building that can explain us why this building takes a particular shape or the extensions take a particular shape in a particular moment of time? I rather argue on the basis of this analysis, I argue that society is not a sufficient source of explanation here, a sufficient source of explanation for architecture or design. Buildings are not simply projections or representations of the social, but they could become social, as we can see with the Whitney. They could become social, as we witness with the Whitney or with the Eiffel Tower examples, because they possess the immense capacity of mobilizing human and non-human actors all together, all at once, all in heterogeneous combinations. In the design controversies, also many new associations, many new connections were traced among those actors, individual and institutional, artistic, economic and political actors that all gathered around the Whitney. This particular capacity of a building to associate both non-human and non-human actors and in different periods of time makes it an important social actor. So the social is not a framework out there explaining us why this is a controversial process or why is there controversy there. The social is in the process of mobilization and enrollment of the actors that gather around this building rather than outside. The social is in there as the building unfolds, as the building design process and the controversies unfold. And the more they unfold, the more actors are mobilized and trace connections, the more social this process becomes. The social is in there, in the process of design, not outside the building, explaining it. We can argue that a building cannot be defined by what it is and what it means, and that is the predominant thinking in the field of history of architecture. We are looking for the meaning, we're looking to try to understand what it is, what kind of structural features we have here, and what does it mean, what kind of meanings we can discover behind. This is the predominant way of thinking in the field. Structural and symbolic structures, features, meanings. But a building can be understood also by what it does, what kind of disputes it provokes and how it resists to attempts of transformation in different periods of time, as we see here with the Whitney. So to understand the Eiffel Tower or the Whitney architecture, it's not enough to question the specific figurative styles or structural styles or the context of design, but we should consider the whole process of transformations of the building, how it acts, how it resists, what it affords, how it compels, challenges, mobilizes, bugs, and mobilizes and gathers different communities around. So this very specific actions, what the building does and how it does it. And this agency, this repertoire of agency, can give us an access to a different understanding of architecture if we get access to what a building does in one or another way, either by following the process of design and what architects do to understand the building, or following the processes of contesting urban knowledge, the control of debating and contesting urban knowledge through controversies and debates in the field of architecture and design, we can gain access to this repertoire of agency, and such an understanding of buildings can bring more awareness of the ways architectural design is made and how it takes part in the making of the social. I will finish this lecture with a few examples of how this thinking about a building as something that is not static, but is a bird in a flight. We have written an article with Bruno Latour. I don't know if you have come across this. Give me a gun. Have you come across this article? Give me a gun and I'll make all buildings move, where you can see the building illustrated with diagrams of Marais, of the flying bird. That's why I call it a bird in a flight. And the building is something that is not just a static, but a complex ecology. I took this kind of theoretical inspiration from my witness study and the ethnographic study of Koolhaas in another project to be able to develop it further, the Mapping Controversies project. And my key question there was to transform, to take this thinking into architectural pedagogy and to ask my architecture students from the Manchester School of Architecture. It was a BA program at the time, and then also at master level in MArch, in the Manchester School of Architecture, in the master's program in Princeton 2 years ago, with the same question in mind: how can we use our advanced design skills to visualize not what a building is and means, but what a building does? The idea behind was to look at different controversies and debates in architecture, and the students were invited to choose one particular debate or a particular controversy that was ongoing, ideally something ongoing, like the London Olympics was the first case we did. So they can follow the design process from the very start and the whole process of design contestation from the very start. And I will show some of those images at the end. The idea was that the students will choose a particular case they're interested in, because they read about this every day. Every day they open the newspapers and they read about the London Olympics and something new happening around the London Olympics. Why not transform this interest that you have in the London Olympics in a studio project or in a mapping controversies project? So they will compile a research dossier on the particular case, and then this information will be mobilized in the visualization of the case. At the end, they have to produce a number of visualizations. The course was running at the start. We had websites. The students produced websites where they talk about the particular controversy, the history of the case. They produced a timeline, an actorial diagram to show the different actors, the profiles of the different actors, and then connections, how those actors are connected and what their arguments are, and visualize this argumentative space. So they developed a number of skills to be able, well, taken from design studios and design skills, to be able to talk about the agency of building, about what buildings do, and to be able also to visualize this. With the help of computational designers, I worked This was another project which started as a consortium with Bruno Latour and other colleagues from this network. 2008-2010 was the project. We started experimenting also with different visual tools, not just the basic drawing tools from the design studio, but some computational tools and parametric modeling, parametric design, parametric modeling, some post-parametric applications were applied as well because we wanted to produce something more sophisticated. And I'll show very quickly, maybe I'll go through this project to show what we did with the London Olympics, and I'll end up by showing some students' examples of works they have, projects they have developed around controversies. With the computational designers, we decided to use the London Olympics because at the time there was a lot of materials on a daily basis, and the project building was still under construction. You can see the building site here. There was a lot written, so we had from the very start we started like with 300 publications from the very start, and then the whole corpus is now it's more than 9,000 media reports and different articles written at the end of this process. So this was a big body of literature, so to say, but only media reports. So we are not talking about interviews or ethnography here, so it's only media reports. The advantage of following this controversy from the very start was that we'll be able to follow in details how the different actors, what the different arguments of the actors are and what will happen as we follow the story. But the disadvantage was that the information was so much that we couldn't fit it into a screen. So the whole mapping was sort of exploding, and we had to do some kind of reduction moves like you do in sociology. You have to come up with a number of typology, or a number of categories so that you can produce a graspable mapping. So we identified 3 types of actors: individual, institutional, and non-human actors at the very start. The individual actors were actors like Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, the architect Peter Cook, some leading figures from the Olympic Committee. So it was these were the actors that appeared in the newspapers on a daily basis. The institutional actors, the London Organization Committee, Hawk Sports, International Olympic Committee, so you can sort of expect what kind of institutional actors will come. The most interesting group was the non-human actors, and there we had a number of design precedents. For instance, the Beijing Olympics or Athens 2004. It was not possible for our actors, individual or collective or organizational, institutional actors, to talk about what's going on now in London without referring to some design precedents like the Athens or the Beijing Stadium. And therefore these precedents became non-human actors because they were mentioned and they made a difference in a story. So an actor is something that makes a difference in a story. So they cannot talk about this process without referring to the precedents. Then we analyzed the data, identified the number of concerns, we call them concerns or interests of the actors, and then the script was then delivered to the computational designers and they produced the visualization. So when we say mapping, we don't mean mapping of an existing reality, we mean mapping as a way of navigating through a complex set of data. The maps that were produced up to that moment in my field, in the field of science and technology studies, all looked like this. Maybe you have come across some of those maps in your science studies readings. So this was a development from the 90s when scholars from the field, from science and technology studies, decided we need something like the factorial analysis that Bourdieu is using, so that we can have some quantitative expression of the qualitative research, that with some quantitative, qualitative methods that will help us strengthen the arguments that are usually produced only on the basis of ethnographic study. And ethnographic study is just one particular field where you spend 2 or 3 years of your life, but it only grasps a particular world which is closed. And how do you connect, for instance, an ethnographic study here with an ethnographic study that is done in the other part of the world? And there was the need to produce more complex maps in a sense that the qualitative information produced on different ethnographic sites could be quantified, connected, and some kind of analytic overviews of this data could be produced so that you can situate your individual findings coming from an ethnography within the kind of a larger landscape of data. And this is the first type of maps produced with a software called Résolu in the 90s with a Russian developer, actually, Andrei Mogutov, Russian-French developer who was teaching us courses at the time. Vincent and myself, we were part of those courses at the time. So this was supposed to be a groundbreaking development of the field. Some of those maps were a step forward, but they were still difficult to read, as you see. This type of map are very difficult to read. You can hardly, so there's a number of clusters that you can identify, but you can hardly read them, and they're also overwhelming. Still, it's kind of overwhelming. You need something more simple. Then we used another software called GovCom by a Dutch developer, Richard Rogers, and the company GovCom. Again, this is a little bit sort of simpler than the overwhelming maps we had at the very start, but the visual language of those maps was very limiting in a way. So as soon as we talk about an actor, we have a bubble, we have a dot, different color dot, and as soon as we talk about a connection, a relation, we have a line, and that's it. So it was a very simplistic visual language, and we wanted something different, something that is user-friendly, easy to read, not that overwhelming, with a different visual language, a little bit more sophisticated, more nuanced visual language, and something that is more dynamic as well, because those maps, as soon as you produce them, you cannot modify them, you cannot incorporate changes, they're quite static in a way. So we wanted something more sophisticated. So we were quite inspired by the new development in the field of architecture, parametric design, and all the thinking with the work of Schumacher and Ram around parametricism and post-parametric applications. So we invited first, it's a colleague of ours from the Manchester School of Architecture, Danny Richards, who helped us to produce a more dynamic visualization. So this is a couple of minutes of animation where you can see the key concerns in the debate. In the London Olympics, we identified 4 key concerns. Legacy was obviously the key concern, and that's why this was a controversy. Design, cost, and community were the concerns. Here, this map is based on data until 2010, and obviously later, 2 years between 2010 and 2012, the concerns changed, and the key concern became security, for instance, which was not a concern at the very start. It was more design legacy. There were a few controversies also because the first architect of the stadium was Alejandro Zaarapolo. Then a British architect, Peter Cook, was commissioned to do after the design after 2007 design conference of the RIBA in 2007. So there were a lot of internal controversies also within the whole process, but the key issue here was legacy. What will happen with this building after the games? The life cycle of the building was extremely controversial, and legacy was very important from the very start. So in this animation, we have this 4 dots. Unfortunately, I cannot show it, but we basically have these 4 concerns, and we can see the actors connecting or disconnecting, grouping and regrouping themselves around those 4 concerns, and you have like a timeline on the top that flashes, and you can see what happens in different moments of time. For instance, this is 2009, and the configuration of the actors' relationships to those concerns, how they can connect to those concerns in 2009. So this was our first attempt to produce a network map that is more dynamic. And in that sense, it was successful, but the visual language is still very limiting. I mean, we still have dancing dots and bubbles, and that's it. At that moment, I started working with Christian Derricks from AEDES London, the Research and Development Department of AEDES in London, and we gave them a crash course in actor network theory. These are leading computational designers. We explained them what we mean by actor network theory and what we wanted to achieve with this particular mapping. And this is the answer, that's what we produced at the end. So we don't have dots and dots with a particular color dots, meaning that we reduced the number of concerns first, because at that moment we had the 9,000 media reports and the whole thing, the data was exploding and it was not possible to map it all. So we decided to reduce the number of concerns. We only include the most important, the key concerns in the story, and we produced a visualization which is user-friendly in a sense that you can switch off some of the design concerns and you can decide to follow only a number of concerns, for instance, legacy and cost. And you can isolate one part of the network of the whole debate, which shows you only how the actors connect to legacy and cost. It's all gray, inspired by Saraceno's work, Tommaso Saraceno's work from the Biennale from 2010. When the visualization was done, he was quite popular and he was doing this kind of flexible nets, which were pretty much actor network theory inspirational for us. Whether they were inspired by ANT, I don't know, but they were quite useful for our thinking as well. So we said to our designers, we don't want colors, we want lines that are parabolic, so the flexible Saraceno-like lines, which I think we have achieved with this visualization, and we don't want an actor to have a pre-established identity before he or she enters the debate. We want to see this actor gaining an identity as he or she connects with others. So even Boris Johnson is not Boris Johnson before he has something to say about the Olympics, but he gains an identity and he becomes the Boris Johnson concerned by the Olympics because he has more and more to say, and because more connections are shaped around his profile, he gains importance and he gains a profile. So we did not want to predetermine the identity of the actors, and the same was with the concern. The concern becomes more and more important because more people talk about it, more actors connect to legacy, and more people have something to say about costs or security at the end of the process. Just before the opening of the Olympics, security was quite important. So security, more and more people mention security. Therefore, the network around security becomes bigger and bigger, and this becomes a concern. So this kind of network approach was taken to the heart, and we actually included the possibility to add colors so as to designate particular groupings. So the color is like a marker that designates the bigger groupings within the map. We also connected this network map with the primary sources. So with a double click on legacy, you go to those articles in the media and to those media reports where you can literally read what Boris Johnson has just said about the legacy of the Olympics, or what Ken Livingstone has just said about the cost issue. And this link between primary sources and secondary kind of overall visualization was quite important. The map here is almost equivalent to a kind of digital archive, kind of visual digital archive, and you can click at any point and you can go to the primary sources, and these primary sources could be, of course, interviews or data from or archival materials or data from ethnographic materials. But in our case, we were experimenting with the media reports. And this, of course, became this project was the starting project also of the Mapping Controversies course at Manchester, which is a course that has been run by a consortium of partners led by Bruno Latour, and maybe you know about this from Vincent. It all started in École des Mines, and it's currently taught in École des Mines, Sciences Po, Manchester, Lausanne, and Copenhagen, a few other universities as well, but it's mainly a European network in Milano as well, so it's a number of European universities. But this platform is especially dedicated to architecture students, and I can, in the last couple of minutes, show you some of the examples from students' projects. This is BA level, for instance, mapping controversies surrounding the Liverpool Museum, which you can see in the back. This is a very controversial museum, but it just won a Sterling Prize, so it's going to be a landmark. It's a landmark to be, in a way, in Liverpool, and some diagrams from student projects as well. Some very well, some of the basically the basic design tools that you use in studio, but they were mobilized for the purposes of controversies, visualization, different actorial diagrams, and this is an example from my course in Princeton, with where we experimented more with interactive diagrams. So the students, the mapping component was just one particular element from a larger course, and the students had to produce interactive diagrams rather than websites. So I will stop here. Maybe you have questions. And this is the website where you can see some of the projects. The London work is here. Some of the key projects also developed by the two programs, and the method is also shortly explained. The mapping process method for architecture and urban debates is also shortly explained on this website. Mapping Controversies Core UK is the website. Thank you.